Usually when an event becomes bigger, it attracts more people. But the 2026 World Cup seems to be going in the opposite direction. The 2026 World Cup is being promoted as the largest World Cup in human history. 48 teams, 104 matches, 3 co-hosting countries, billions of people watching worldwide. And in theory, this should be an unprecedented football festival. But just a few days before the opening ceremony, something very strange is happening. Hundreds of thousands of tickets have not yet been sold. Some opening matches still have empty seats. Many hotels in the host cities are reporting lower than expected bookings. Meanwhile, the number of international visitors to the US is declining instead of booming. The more you look at the numbers, the more confusing the picture becomes. How could an event expected to bring in tens of billions of dollars fail to attract the anticipated number of fans? What happened to the tournament called the biggest sports party on the planet? In today's video, we will investigate a paradox that is causing many economists, travel experts, and even football fans to question, is the 2026 World Cup becoming a victim of its own enormous ambition? There is a very interesting principle in economics. When a product becomes larger, more attractive, and is promoted more, demand usually increases accordingly. That's why FIFA has spent many years building the image of the 2026 World Cup as an unprecedented event in history. They talk about more than $40 billion in economic impact. They talk about around 800,000 jobs being created. They talk about millions of fans flocking to North America, and they talk about a wave of tourism that could change the service industry in the United States, Canada, and Mexico for many years to come. Sounds like a giant machine getting ready to take off, but then the actual numbers started to appear. And that's when the story becomes much more interesting. According to reports from the American hotel industry, about 80% of hotels in host cities are reporting that bookings are lower than expected. Take a moment to think about that. This is not a local festival. This is not an event that lasts just for the weekend. This is the World Cup. It is the biggest sporting event on the planet. However, many hotels are looking at empty rooms and wondering, where are the guests? The shocking point is that for many years, people have always heard that the World Cup would create a tourism boom. But now, some organizations in the hospitality industry even describe the tournament with a rather cold phrase, an event that did not create the expected impact. It sounds a bit like throwing a grand birthday party, renting the largest hall in the city, ordering a 3-tiered cake. But when the party starts, you find many chairs still empty. And this is the more noteworthy point. FIFA once expected millions of international tourists to flood into the United States. But as the World Cup approaches, the number of international visitors to the US has not increased as much as expected. Some experts believe that many families are having to budget more carefully for every dollar spent. After several years of struggling with inflation, high living costs, and expensive airfare, the dream of watching the World Cup live is starting to resemble a luxury item rather than a memorable vacation. Perhaps the biggest insight here is this: scale and demand do not always go hand in hand. An event can be the largest in history, but that doesn't automatically make it accessible for everyone. And if you also find this paradox worth pondering, please like and subscribe, because what we are about to discuss is even more surprising, because it turns out the issue is not just about the number of tourists. The deeper they dig, the more they discover another reality. Many fans still want to attend the World Cup, but they are being blocked by a huge barrier. And that barrier starts with what seems like the simplest thing: ticket prices. If the previous part raised the question of why tourism has not exploded as expected, then this part might be leading us to the first answer. Because sometimes the issue is not that people don't want to come. The problem is that they can no longer afford to come. Imagine you are an ordinary football fan. You have been waiting for the World Cup for 4 years. It could be 8 years. Even for many Americans, this is the only chance in their lifetime to watch the World Cup on home soil. You start saving money, planning for time off, inviting family or friends to join. Then the ticket sales day arrives, and that's when the dream starts colliding with reality. Some tickets for the final are listed at over $4,000. Some premium experience packages exceed $30,000. Yes, you heard it right, $30,000. That's enough money to buy an old car. Enough for many families to cover a few months of living expenses or even a trip around the world. And here's the first shocking point. That's just the ticket price. Because after the ticket, there are hotels, plane tickets, transportation, food, and countless other additional expenses. Some estimates suggest that if a family wants to watch multiple matches throughout the tournament, the total cost could reach tens of thousands of dollars. Suddenly, the World Cup no longer resembles a festival for everyone. It started to resemble a luxury vacation for those with very special budgets. But what makes many fans feel unfair is not just the high price, it's the way the prices are set. For the first time in World Cup history, FIFA has widely implemented a dynamic pricing model. Simply put, ticket prices are not fixed. It changes according to demand, just like how ride-hailing prices surge when it rains or during peak hours. That creates a very strange feeling. Fans don't know the actual price, don't know when to buy, and don't know if the ticket they're looking at will be more expensive tomorrow. Not only that, but only a small fraction of the tickets are sold at the base price. The rest are in the flexible pricing system. In other words, the more people want to participate in the world's biggest football festival, the higher the cost to join. It sounds reasonable from a business perspective, but it raises a very simple question for many. Is the World Cup being built for the fans or for revenue? And perhaps the deepest issue lies here. For decades, the World Cup has been a place where a worker, a teacher, a truck driver, or an ordinary family could dream of being in the stands. That is the beauty of football. It connects very different people through the same emotion. But as ticket prices continue to soar, many people are starting to feel like they are standing outside the gates of the very festival they helped create. Do you think a sports event still retains its soul when fewer and fewer ordinary people can participate directly? But wait, even stranger is that even those who can afford the tickets sometimes still cannot make it to the stadium. Because behind the story of ticket prices, there exists another barrier less talked about, but one that is leaving thousands of fans around the world stranded outside the 2026 World Cup. If the previous part was a story about money, then this part takes us to an even stranger paradox. Because it turns out there are people who are not deterred by the ticket price. They have money, they have time, they have the desire, but they still can't make it to the World Cup. Think about that for a moment. The World Cup was created to bring together fans from all over the world. That's where people fly thousands of miles just to sing their national anthem for a few minutes before the match. It is a place where flags, drums, and songs from dozens of different cultures come together in one stadium. But when the 2026 World Cup takes place, many fans are standing in front of a door they are not sure they can step through. One of the most attention-grabbing stories is not about a player or a coach. That is the story of Omar Abdul Qadir Artan, the Somali referee. He was selected to participate in the World Cup and was supposed to become one of the rare representatives of Somalia on the biggest stage in world football. But according to published reports, he was not allowed to enter the United States. Try to imagine that feeling. You are invited to participate in the biggest event in your field only for the journey to end right at the border. But the story doesn't end there. Fans from many countries also have to face more complex visa procedures, longer approval times, or barriers that make their plans to watch the World Cup fragile. For some countries, securing a ticket to the World Cup has already been a feat. For their fans, seeing the national team play live is a dream of a whole generation. However, now many people have to watch from afar, and here is a thought-provoking, contrasting image. On one side are the stands still with empty seats. On one side are those who are ready to fill those seats but cannot be present. Sounds like a restaurant with empty tables, but customers are stuck outside. From an economic standpoint, that is already a paradox. On an emotional level, it is much more haunting. Isn't the World Cup not just about selling tickets? It sells the feeling of belonging to something greater than oneself. And when those who crave that feeling the most find it difficult to participate, the tournament will lose a special energy that money cannot buy. In your opinion, can a World Cup maintain its global spirit if more and more international fans can only watch it on screen? If you find the stories behind the scenes just as interesting as what happens on the field, don't forget to like and subscribe, because right after this, we will delve deeper into the story. And this time the issue is no longer about tickets or visas. It is the question that is starting to annoy many people. Is the World Cup being held for the fans, or are the fans becoming tools for a huge money-making machine? The deeper we dig, another question begins to emerge. If fans are having too much trouble participating, then who is really benefiting from the 2026 World Cup? The answer might surprise many people because according to the perception of many fans, this year's World Cup resembles an extremely sophisticated revenue machine. And the interesting thing is that almost every gear in that machine revolves around one goal: maximizing commercial value. Let's start with tickets. We have talked about ticket prices skyrocketing due to dynamic pricing, but the story doesn't end there. When tickets are resold on licensed platforms, transaction fees continue to appear. When fans try to find a better seat, another portion of revenue is generated. Jokingly, sometimes it feels like the ball hasn't even started rolling, but the fans' wallets have already played a full 90 minutes. And here's the more noteworthy point. Under public pressure, FIFA finally allowed spectators to bring sealed soft plastic water bottles with limited capacity into the stadium. Sounds normal, right? But what surprised many people was that there had been a controversy surrounding bringing water into the stadium, especially considering that many matches were held during the North American summer with quite high temperatures. A small detail like a water bottle, which seemed insignificant, has become a topic of international debate. That shows the sensitivity of fans to the feeling that everything inside the stadium is being commercialized. But the story is bigger than food or drink. Look at the stadiums. Many famous venues have to temporarily drop their familiar commercial names to comply with the tournament's branding regulations. Local symbols are replaced with generic event names. From a business perspective, this makes perfect sense. The sponsors want to protect the value of their investment. But emotionally, many people feel like their city is wearing a uniform they didn't choose. And this is perhaps the most thought-provoking aspect of this part. When an event grows to an excessively large scale, sometimes it starts to resemble a gigantic shopping mall more than a community festival. Everything is still very grand. Everything is still very professional. But some people are starting to feel like they are being treated as customers before being seen as fans. Of course, no one denies that global scale events need revenue to operate. But the question worth discussing is, what is the boundary between commercial development and preserving the fan experience? In your opinion, has the World Cup found that balance yet? And right after this, we will leave behind the revenue figures and move on to an even more surprising story. A story about local identity, cultural symbols, and why a mural in Dallas makes many people feel that the World Cup is taking away more than they realize. In the past few minutes, we have talked a lot about money, about ticket prices, about the hotel, about tourism, but perhaps the most subtle impact of the 2026 World Cup does not lie in the wallets of the people. It lies in a much harder to measure place, the identity of the host cities, because each city has its own personality. New York is not like Dallas. Dallas is not like Kansas City. And Kansas City is definitely not like Mexico City. What makes people love a city is not just the buildings or stadiums. Those are the familiar names, the local symbols, the stories that the people have been attached to for decades. It's like the soul of a place. You know, to comply with the league's branding regulations, many famous stadiums will temporarily lose their familiar names. Matif Stadium becomes New York, New Jersey Stadium. Levi Stadium becomes San Francisco Bay Area Stadium. A T Stadium becomes Dallas Stadium. Technically, it's just a name change for a few weeks, but try to imagine one day someone comes to your neighborhood and says that all the familiar signs will be taken down to fit a global promotional campaign. Nothing is destroyed, but the sense of familiarity suddenly vanished. Interestingly, most people understand the commercial reasons behind this decision. The sponsors want to protect their interests. That is completely reasonable. But sometimes what makes sense on paper feels very different in real life. A city starts to resemble a pre-staged theater where local props must temporarily retreat backstage. Then there's the story in Dallas, and this is perhaps the strongest contrasting image of the entire 2026 World Cup. A famous mural featuring images of whales and dolphins, which has existed for over 2 decades as part of the city's landscape, has become a focal point of controversy after being covered up for a new promotional campaign related to the World Cup. What makes many people sad is not just the appearance of the new paint. What makes them uneasy is the feeling that something familiar is being replaced by something temporary. There is a very nice saying to understand a city: look at what it chooses to keep. And sometimes such debates make people wonder the opposite. What What will happen when a city starts to put away the things that make up its identity? If you have ever lived in a place for a long time, you might understand this feeling. A familiar cafe closes down. An old sign disappears. A corner of the street once tied to memories has been completely transformed. It's not the end of the world, but there is still a sense of something missing. Could it be that global events do not just bring money to the city, they also bring invisible pressures on the local culture? And sometimes the hardest to see cost is the sense of belonging of the local people. In your opinion, how much should a city change to host a global event? Please share your thoughts in the comments section. Perhaps the real issue with the 2026 World Cup does not lie with FIFA, the tickets, or the murals, but it is reflecting something that is happening with both the economy and the mindset of modern people. At this point, perhaps we need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Because if we only look at the World Cup, it's easy to think that this is a story about FIFA, about ticket prices, or about the empty seats in the stands. But the more we piece the puzzle together, the more a different feeling emerges. Maybe the World Cup is not the issue. Maybe it's just a mirror reflecting something bigger happening in society. Think about what we have seen. The hotel did not meet the expected booking levels. Many fans are not willing to spend thousands of dollars on a trip. International visitors to the US are increasing more slowly than expected. At first glance, these are individual data points, but when placed side by side, they begin to tell the same story. That is the story of people who are having to think more carefully before each spending decision. The noteworthy point is, for decades, major events have often been seen as magnets for money and tourists. But the 2026 World Cup is revealing a new reality. Even the biggest sporting event on the planet cannot be immune to the pressure of living costs. When rent, food, insurance, healthcare, and monthly bills increasingly take up a large portion of the family budget, spending on experiences is starting to be pushed down the priority list. Not because people hate traveling, not because they don't love football, but because sometimes the reality is much simpler. They have to choose. There is quite an interesting image. In the past, the World Cup was like an express train that millions of people tried to buy tickets to board. But today, many people are still standing on the platform, still wanting to board that train, but having to look at their bank accounts before making a decision. That's not a loss of interest. It's caution. People don't give up on the World Cup. People are giving up on many things at once. A long vacation, an international trip, an item I once wanted to buy, an experience that was once on the wish list. The World Cup just happens to be the most obvious example because of its massive scale. What is worth pondering is that even an event as heavily promoted as the World Cup struggles to attract the expected number of attendees. The question is no longer whether there is an issue with the World Cup. The question is, what is changing in the mindset of modern consumers? If you also find yourself considering expenses more carefully than you did a few years ago, when you might not have thought twice, please share your thoughts in the comments. And now we will move on to the biggest question of this video. Is the scariest thing about the 2026 World Cup really the revenue, ticket prices, or declining tourism? Or is there something even more important gradually disappearing from the sport known as the people's game? After all, we've talked about ticket prices, hotels, travel, and the billions of dollars involved. Perhaps it's time to ask another question, a question that does not appear in economic reports, not appearing in donor meetings, and it cannot be measured by revenue charts either. What is a truly successful World Cup measured by? Many people would say it's the viewership. Others will say it's profit. Some will look at television rights revenue or commercial records. But if you ask fans who have loved football for decades, the answer is probably much simpler. They will talk about memories. No one remembers exactly how many billions of dollars the 1,994 World Cup generated for the US economy. But many people still remember the feeling of seeing the world's football stars in the flesh for the first time. No one tells their grandchildren about advertising revenue. They tell stories about the singing on stage, about the flags waving, about the moment the entire stadium holds its breath before a penalty kick. That's what makes the World Cup different from a regular entertainment product. It doesn't sell a match, it sells a memory that can stay with a person for a lifetime. And that is also the reason many people feel uneasy when looking at what is happening. Because if an ordinary family has to think too long before buying tickets, if the most loyal fans have to stay outside died due to costs or other barriers, then what is lost is not just a seat in the stands. What is lost is a story they could have carried with them for the rest of their lives. Imagine a boy or girl who loves soccer at the age of 12. 4 years later, 8 years later, they might not remember the score of every match, but you will remember the first time you stepped into the stadium. Remember the cheers rising like ocean waves. Remember the feeling of a racing heart when the national anthem played. Those are the moments that turn a viewer into a lifelong fan. And here is the final paradox. The 2026 World Cup could completely break all revenue records. It could become the most watched World Cup in history. It could bring in more money than any tournament before. But a tournament can still win big on the financial balance sheet while losing in a much less visible place. That is the heart of the fans. And perhaps the biggest question of the 2026 World Cup is not how many billions of dollars will be generated, but how many fans truly still feel that this tournament was made for them. The 2026 World Cup is setting new records in terms of scale, revenue, and commercialization. But at the same time, we are also witnessing some uncomfortable signs. Ticket prices skyrocketing, tourism not booming as expected, many fans facing barriers to attendance, and several host cities debating the cost of hosting a global event. That doesn't mean the 2026 World Cup will fail. This tournament could still become one of the most watched sporting events in history. But it raises a very thought-provoking question for the future of world football. If costs continue to rise with each World Cup, is the sport known as the people's game gradually becoming an experience reserved for a select few? I would love to hear your opinion. In your opinion, what is the biggest issue with the 20,126 World Cup? Is it the ticket prices? Is tourism declining? Are there barriers for international fans? Or is it simply that football is changing in ways that many people haven't yet realized? Please share your thoughts in the comments section. I read almost all the comments and really look forward to hearing your perspectives. If you enjoy in-depth videos analyzing the economy, society, politics, and the changes happening in the United States, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next content. Thank you for taking the time to watch until the end. Fuß des Blindern,